Okay, great. So good evening, everyone. My name is Paige Sarlin. I am an assistant professor of media study at the Department of Media Study at University of Buffalo. And this is Plasma Lecture Series 2022. And tonight I am very excited that our guest is Joel Ong, who is a professor of computational arts at York University. I'm going to, two things to say about the series. We are recording this lecture. So if you do not wish to have your name or face recorded, please mute yourself and turn off your camera. Let's see what else to tell you. This is a public lecture series that's sponsored. It's also a class, which is why you heard me talking to a student. Sponsored by the Department of Media Study and the Office of the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences here at University of Buffalo. Importantly, we begin with the acknowledgement that the land on which the University of Buffalo operates is the territory of the Seneca Nation, a member of the Haudenosaunee Six Nations Confederacy. This territory is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty of Peace and Friendship, a pledge to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. It is also covered by the 1794 Treaty of Canandaigua between the United States government and the Six Nations Confederacy, which further affirmed Haudenosaunee land rights and sovereignty in the state of New York. Today, this region is still the home to the Haudenosaunee people, and we are grateful for the opportunity to live, work, and share ideas in this territory. We begin with this acknowledgement for the reasons outlined by Adam Khalil, an artist who is a member of the Ojibwe tribe, who Almu Escobar Lopez last week mentioned. Adam Khalil has outlined his description of the potential power of acknowledgements as a practice in the following way. So I quote him: a territorial acknowledgement can demonstrate a coming to an awareness and provoke thought and reflection, all of which are essential in beginning to establish healthy reciprocal relations. It can become part of living out our apologies for the historical reality of settler colonialism and its ongoing legacy and continued attack on people and land. It is an important and fundamental practice that we understand must occur on the levels of epistemology and culture. So end quote. And those were Adam Khalil's words. So as always, Plasma is free and open to the UB community and the public. For more information or to be added to our weekly announcement email, I will post an email that you should send a message to in the chat in a moment. Next week is spring break, so we will not have here at UB, so we will not have a lecture, but please come back on March 28th when Crystal Z. Campbell will be presenting their work. For a very exciting night of streaming video. So without more further ado, I will now, Stephanie Rothenberg, Professor of Art here at the University of Buffalo, will introduce our excellent and amazing guest, Joel Ong. Take it away, Stephanie.
Thanks, Paige. Is my sound okay? Great. Hello, everybody, and good evening. And I'm really, really excited that Joel, I will say, is back at UB. I first met Joel Ong, I don't know how many years ago, wasn't too long, but Joel was a resident artist at the Coalesce Biological Arts Center that's here at UB. Some of you might be familiar with it, but if you're not, you should definitely check it out. It's over in Hochschutter, and we have a very exciting art and science lab where really interesting work happens, and lots of artists come through from all over the world. And that's where I first met Joel, and was very intrigued by his work because he was doing a collaboration with a friend, I think, who's based out in LA. And they were doing this workshop where they were sending kites up into the sky, what you do with kites on campus. And the kites, I believe, had little like petri dishes, and they were collecting just kind of dust, right? Just molecules in the environment. And I'm like, gosh, what is this artist all about? And so started to get to know Joel a little bit more and looking into his work, and really fascinated in the way that he takes science, and specifically working with scientific data, and he turns into these new forms of poetry, right? And he makes visible all of this invisible phenomena of the Anthropocene, right? The things that we can't see but are in our environments, like toxic particles in the air pollution, what's really happening in the sounds of the wind and why they're changing them. And he just makes us more aware of it, right? In this very nuanced and poetic way. And he talks, when I've heard him give talks, he always refers to the French philosopher Gaston Baudrillard, which I'm sure he'll refer to in his talk again. And it's just so important nowadays in bridging the arts and sciences to make science more accessible. And I feel like he really does that in his work by keeping it playful, but also just really a lot of wonder in what he does. And he talks about these poetic bridges that when he's investigating the environment through more specifically relationships of sound to physical space. And he's very interested, as he talks about in his work, the visibility and audibility of ambient phenomena, with a particular focus on the wind and the atmospheric microbiome, right? So we keep hearing about our own personal microbiomes and what's inside us, but what is the microbiome of the atmosphere, right? Just such an interesting question. And I take from his artist statement where he talks about that his work explores the way objects and spaces can function as repositories of frozen sound. And he refers to Jack Burnham, who's a well-known systems theorist, that says art that does not reside in material entities, but in relations between people and the components of their environment. So Joel, as Paige mentioned, is a professor in the School of Arts, Media, Performance, and Design at York University in Toronto. So he's not too far away. And he's also part of the Sensorium Lab, which is a really interesting experimental lab that focuses on bridges between art, science, and technology. And he did his PhD in digital arts and experimental media at DX Arts, University of Washington, which is a really interesting program. So if you're looking into going elsewhere after undergrad, it might be a program you want to check out. But he was also really privileged to have the opportunity to study at SymbioticA, which is in Western Australia. It's in Perth, and it is basically the most renowned center for biological arts. And he was able to work under the supervision of BioArt pioneers, Ionat, Zurr, and Oron. And through this work, he's been involved in so many exhibitions around the world, including Ars Electronica in Linz, Austria, the Currents New Media Festival, which takes place in Santa Fe, New Mexico, the Ontario Science Center. He's been involved in ISEA, especially there was one more recently in Montreal, in SyggRaph. He's also participated in conferences, one that we were at Trinity College in Dublin. His work has been mentioned by the renowned new media art writer Ed Shanken in Art and Electronic Media. So really looking forward to, we haven't been in touch in a while, what you've been doing recently, especially during the pandemic, but really looking forward to your talk. So without further ado, let's welcome Joel Ong.
Thank you so much. Let me just start by sharing one screen right here. And I would just apologize right off the bat if you do hear a lot of rumbling or moving in the background. My kids are home. It's that time of the evening, so I will try to, if anything's not clear, just let me know and I'll repeat it. But in general, thank you so much for that introduction. Steph and I go back a fair bit, and I am so happy to be able to see you on Zoom. At some point, we're definitely going to hang out in person again. But Stephanie was the first, I think, one of the first resident artists that we had at Sensorium, I'm absolutely a big fan of her work. We did one, two, maybe three presentations together at a conference, and at that, and after that, she basically said like she should hire me as a manager because I was just like sprouting praise all over. I think that's the kind of collegial respect and also like dear friendship that I have with Stephanie and a lot of members of the UV community as well. As she mentioned, I was at Coalesce Centre for BioArts, and we have great connections with Paul and with Solon over there. And we really, and my dean right now actually is, my dean right now is Sarah Beijing, was a professor at UB as well. And I think she started the Techni Institute there. So, there is a lot of overlaps, I would say, both conceptually, also practically, in the stuff that we do. So I would really like to thank Professor Page today in the Department of Media Studies and the College of Arts and Sciences at UB for this invitation. Before I start, I would also like to say I've chosen to provide a breadth of work rather than kind of in depth into a lot of stuff. So if it seems a bit of a whiplash, please let me know during the Q&A. We can definitely elaborate on any of the projects as we seem fit. I will also say that the one of the readings that you guys had around the microbiome is definitely one that is very close to my heart that Mick and I have been working on for many years. However, what I will be talking about primarily today is not so much the question of what is or what is it going to look like, but more why. So why am I interested in an atmospheric microbiome? Why am I interested in the wind? Why am I interested in something that is seemingly invisible, but has only recently, I think, during the pandemic, come so vividly alive in not only our imaginations, but also in our daily lives? As you can see, this is my professional credentials. I think you guys have already heard enough of it, so I'm just going to skip past that. Sensorium is the Center for Digital Art and Experimental Media, and so for the last 10 years of its existence, we have been focusing very much on the frontiers of art, science, and technology, and really interrogating that from a multidisciplinary lens. But as the pandemic has shown us, purely focusing on the frontiers of technology is not really enough. I think the pandemic has exposed, infrastructurally all these systemic imbalances within the communities of practice that we have. Artists are always wondering like, what is productivity now when we can't meet people in person? Theater practitioners are going, oh no, what is this? But also when we think about communities outside and around York University, the university campuses, that I think as university students and faculty members, we are generally accountable to. A lot of questions are about access and literacy. So Sensorium has been working on these literacy programs for digital access in the community, and I'll put I will have some examples to show you in a couple of minutes. But we've also been thinking, now, what does it mean then, when this pandemic restrictions have been lifted, to return to the sensorium? How would we be able to think about this idea of the sensorium, which basically means the seat of perception is the aggregate of all your sensory inputs, right? How are we able to see that, and how does it make us better people, in general? So we've been doing a series of projects called Return to the Sensorium, and we've looked at sensory discomforts of Zoom as one. In this picture over here, you see a panoramic view of our event called Sonic Sensibilities, where a professor, Doug Van Noort, he used to work up in Troy with the late Pauline Oliveros. He's giving us a sound walk, basically on listening with your feet. Now, what does that mean? Listening with your feet. Isn't that a cool idea? If you walk around in the snow and you're listening with your feet, it automatically changes the way that you walk. You become so much more sensitive to the sound that your feet are making, but also if you expand that thought out a little bit, also the impact that your body is making on its environment, right? So these are very expanded levels, multi-scalar levels of conversations that we're having at Sensorium that are also catalyzed a lot by what's happening in the world today. I also am the PI for the AMPD Makerspace, the faculty makerspace, and you guys have a makerspace. You guys know what makerspace does, so I want to elaborate on it. We are evangelists for digital fabrication. So I live in a fairly traditional fine arts center. So there's I don't actually live there. I mean, I work there. I'm a member of the faculty there, and a lot of our operations are basically talking to printmakers or other kinds of designers about introducing digital fabrication workflows into their art making strategies. So if you guys already know of a lot of tools around 3D printing, laser cutting, modeling, photogrammetry, you're already a step ahead of the curve. And as you know, these are tools that can really help to make your artistic process a lot more efficient. Okay, so I've titled this talk, I've titled this talk Movement and Stasis at the End of the World. And the framing of this talk is taken mostly from a series of texts concerned with art making at the end of the world. And of course, one major influential work is Timothy Morton's Hyperobjects, on which he considers the hyperobjectivity of global warming. To Natalie Lovelace, who elevates the role of the arts, especially the arts that are attuned to human and more than human justice, in shaping cultural imaginaries through and despite the urgency of the Anthropocene. More poignant today than ever before, in this turbulence that we all recognize in the social and political violence, she says, "We are not looking at the end of the world writ large, but the end of a world as we know it under petrocultural, colonial capitalism, and anthropocentric humanism." Isn't that a beautiful thing? That at the end of the pandemic, we can actually say that this is the end of a world. And what is that world? Could we really be looking at the end of a world of petrocultural colonial capitalism? So in this vein, my own work considers art making as a kind of risk-taking, and it asks, who is the artist accountable to? I have attempted to answer this through participatory networks that embed the artists within communities of practice that extend beyond the art world into the sciences, biology, social justice, advocacy, citizen science, and community building. So with that in mind, with that framing as an artist, I will now begin my talk. So, greetings. My name is Joel Ong, and I'm a first-generation settler in Canada of Chinese and Southeast Asian descent. My mother is Puale Swan, and she, like my dad, are third-generation settlers in Singapore. My great-grandmother traveled to Singapore in the 1920s from the Fujian province in China to work in construction as one of the famed Hong Totings in Singapore, and even as she had bound feet, as it was common at that time in China. She and my grandfather lived through the Second World War and the Japanese occupation of Southeast Asia in the 1940s, and my father and mother were born shortly after this in the middle of a great transition of power that saw our nation move from Japanese rule to British rule to Malaysian rule and finally to independence in 1967. So defining a coherent cultural and national identity is a burden that I carry with me through my travels, since I, like many of us, have been settlers in so many places and inherited so many different narratives, it's really hard to find out where you fit in. But I now call Takaranto my home. That's where I am right now. That has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat, and it's now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. This territory is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. I recognize that I have adopted many of the benefits of this society as a foreigner and uninvited guest, and I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to work and raise a family in the communities that have grown in the treaty lands. So in the class that I'm teaching this semester, somewhat similar to the class here, students are instructed to write and narrate positionality statements along with a land acknowledgement at the start of each class. And I'm really struck by the diversity of our student body, but also the way that a common thread amongst all of them is that their ancestry is marred by wars and trauma in Europe, Africa, and China that have forced migration across the world. So I always say this to my students, and I really think they carry a real strength and resilience in their daily lives, like you guys all carry this. And I quote from our colleague at York, Christine Sharp's book, In the Wake, that considers the ancestry of slavery and Black subjugation as a current, not distant modality of living, that we cannot memorialize an event that is still ongoing. She generously considers her metaphor of the wake to be an expansive praxis able to fit within other contexts. And so while it's essential vocabulary for me to understand the youth that I work with now in the communities around York University who are predominantly Black, it's also a reminder for us as educators to realize the ancestral and political ripples within the diverse diasporic movements and to see our research and mentoring, especially of racialized students, as wake work. In the same vein, just last month, Williams Lake First Nation in BC in British Columbia announced that they had found another 93 potential unmarked grave sites associated with the St. Joseph Mission Residential School, with the possibility of many more in the future. And I also want to say here that we lean on the resilience of the First Nation communities through their history of trauma and genocide in the way that they are holding the institutions accountable for and providing actionable responses for everyone to work on, but also in the way that they are changing the narratives towards a hope for the future by leading the way in scholarly, environmental, and artistic innovations. Living in the wake of such trauma, we cannot but recognize the lands, seas, and airs that we have appropriated for profit as settler colonialists, and that the material substrates that enable our digital and virtual platforms are also deeply connected to the life, sustenance, and ancestry of First Nation communities. So, my research is located at the burgeoning intersection of digital media and biology. And I identify with what Eugene Thacker calls Biometer, from 2004, which is a fundamental equivalency and interchangeability between organic and computational code to program and effect life. And so I approach this notion of life from multiple perspectives. There's many different definitions of life, obviously, and if you ask a bioartist what life is, it's kind of always very contested. But I look at it through these lenses. One, through the metaphor of the oikos. So the root word for ecology is oikos, which means house or dwelling, and the way that digital systems may contribute to or constitute the hospitable environments, the food, the nourishment for life and diversity to thrive. How can we push that metaphor as far as you can think? Two, through practices that share and document lived experience, where immersive digital systems may shape or augment oral narratives, text and images, or other forms of community archiving in creative virtual worlds. And three, through lab-based experiments that reflect on the plasticity and malleability of our shared atmosphere, and to imagine it as a site for critical discourse. It's very interesting to note now from the pandemic that we're seeing a lot more emphasis on the air as something that is, a medium of transport, with the virus flying, what's an airborne bacteria, what's an airborne virus, and is that actually harmful, and how harmful is it, right? If you sneeze, you have that 6-foot radius, which automatically becomes shattered. You go, well, if you sneeze, it's something that will go 12 foot or maybe even beyond. Right? And so the idea that the atmosphere is shared has become this very militarized narrative. And as you will see, or as you probably have seen in certain parts of my work, thank you so much, guys, for taking the time to read through it. That's my honor, really. That a lot of my work happens through 3 different stages. They're very fluid pathways. They don't necessarily go one after another, but they involve pathways through field work. We call that in vivo lived experiences up on top, immersions in laboratories such as at Coalesce, or more recently at the U of T's Gutman lab here in pathogenic evolution, in vitro, and studios of computational practices in silico. And in communities outside academia through community science and advocacy work, which are constantly in potentia. So that, I think, would be the basis of a lot of the work that I do. Where much of my work in the past is focused on design thinking practices that were iterative, my work moves today a lot more towards participatory action research in the way that the systems I design, they're not really meant for like a single artist to be brooding over issues and kind of iterating over design processes, but they're meant for participation from very diverse communities. And this may include infrastructure building for self-sustainability and self-determination, which are especially important in the case of grassroots organizations, but also to be an ally in efforts against systemic biases. Okay, so I hope that gives you a relatively good grounding of the kind of principles that I operate upon. And now I'll go through one research trajectory that I have, which has brought me from I think that's 2013 all the way until like last week, basically. And hopefully you'll get some idea of why it is that I do the things that I do. So this artistic trajectory began in this project that I entitled 42 Degrees Southwest, If By Any Means We Get There, which is prototyped in summer of 2013, where a mishap in my family prompted a deep desire to return to the place of my birth. The piece represented this desire with a small cart that was fitted with a GPS unit directed towards home as the crow flies, although it was tethered to the wall by an unfolding spool of string. So it was a symbol of inevitability, of being unable to realize this journey in its entirety. But in experiencing the piece, I hoped that visitors were able to imagine the distance between the gallery and the cart's destination, despite the fact that the piece's inherent tragedy lay in the way it was set up, basically, to fail. So you can see there, the estimated distance was 12,970 kilometers, and it would have taken slightly over 5 million hours to get home. While the Sisyphean tragedy need not apply to everyone, journeys are universal, and the shared identity of the pilgrim or migrant became especially obvious in conversations with my course mates and fellow international students as I was going through my programs in grad school. And this idea of a journey that was undertaken not only physically, but metaphorically as well, in the sense of a perpetual desire for going somewhere else. If I asked you right now, where in the world would you be if you could be anywhere in the world? And I'm sure a lot of people have very, very different responses. But you can also see, depending on what time of the year it is, or what time of the epoch we're living in, a year ago, you might have said one thing in relation to the pandemic, and this year it might be something else. And you can see the complex emotions that are all interwoven within these. So I did this project, 2013, called Aolias notification system, that started with a very simple question. If we could transport you anywhere in the world, where would you be? And there was a small interface at the gallery where people would type in where they would want to be. and they would provide some GPS coordinates if they were not available on Google. And people had very geographically centered locations, like Papua New Guinea, for instance, or like the address, the actual address of a family home, to fictitious or imaginary places like Mom's kitchen, and where would we place that on a map, right? So those were interesting conversations, and at the end of it, we drew a map, and this map, I called it a cartography of desire, but it basically drew a string from the gallery location, which was in Seattle, out to all the different locations where people had listed as their ideal destination. And for a period of a month after the installation, I took real-time wind data from the gallery space itself. And every time the wind blew in the direction of one of these spaces, I would send them a text message saying, hey, the wind is now in your sails in the direction of whatever it is that they put. Please observe a moment in the direction depicted on your compass. And I also gave them a small bag of winds that had an imprint of a small bag of wind. It was basically a small little cloth bag that I blew up slightly, and it had a print of Athanasius Kircher's first Aeolian harp drawing. This is like in the 16th century, 17th century. It was a Jesuit priest who invented the first stringed instruments that would play off the activity of the wind. It would just have these haunting resonances. So I printed that on the, just to get the sense that, there were strings that were tying you back, perhaps to the places you wanted to, places you came from and places that you wanted to go to. So this project was quickly followed up by another project called #Home. And the reason why I started this was I realized that at the location of the gallery, it was really more interesting. Actually, people were more interested to talk about where they wanted to be and what their destinations were and why, right? Those stories were so rich and so diverse. I was really interested. Some people talked about home, and when you talk about home, like the key memories around your particular space are something that you can share with people. Like for instance, if home to you represented food, fun, family, and I don't know, some particular, the beach, for instance, I would be able to identify with you on that stuff, and so we would have this funny kind of post-geographical sharing of a space in our mind's eye, right? I was really interested in this idea, and at the same time, I was building on Italo Calvino's work Invisible Cities as well, where he has 53 cities that are depicted very poetically in this book. And the story goes that Kublai Khan, who is this Mongolian king who has conquered so much land, can't actually go and visit all the lands that he has conquered. So he asks Marco Polo to give him a description of each of them. And each of these 52 cities are a very, very imaginative and fictional depiction of what Marco Polo imagines these cities would be like. At some point in that book, however, you start to wonder if they are 52 distinct, different cities, or if they're just, different angles of Marco Polo's memory of his own home in Italy. Because bearing in mind, he was also not only a migrant, I think he was somewhat of a refugee or a prisoner that was captured by Kublai Khan. And, he would have been pining for his house, for his home, and thinking about it constantly. So how these memories start to be shaped by the textual narratives and the stories that we tell and we share about them were really interesting to me. So I did this data visualization project where I took keywords from each of the 52 different cities and I made a data visualization plot out of it. And so these are 9 of these cities, and this was a prototype. And after that, I did the same strategy, in a gallery space where I asked people, what are 5 descriptors that you can tell me about your home? And, just to poll and just to look at the communicative medium that was most prevalent at that time, I did a live Twitter scrape for about 2 weeks after somebody gave me their 5 keywords. And I searched for all instances of people mentioning these terms around the world. And so I put them on a map, and based on their proximity to each other, I grew a city out of them, and this became essentially the invisible cities of each person's home. So they were 3D printed, and after that, put in jars. And I think the most important part of that to me was they were returned to the people who had given me those descriptors. So it was like a large, I think, one year project where everything was done, everything was made within the first month, but then I spent the rest of the year just trying to track people down, and I had to go across borders sometimes to give them back their jars. Now, the advent of the much publicized crisis in 2015 cast human migration as one of the biggest issues yet facing modern society. And, this was something that I was very, very conscious of in Seattle, where I was creating these works at that time, where there were about 1 million refugees that had crossed over the Mediterranean Sea, and, a lot of them were Syrian. I was living in Seattle at that time, and Seattle, to some, is seen as a kind of ecotopia, where homeless or refugees from across America would kind of head west and hope to end up in Seattle, because apparently there are really nice people there, or very generous people there, and to a certain extent it's true. However, most people do not know that in Seattle, just about an hour south, there is a for-profit detention center called the Northwest Detention Center in Tacoma, Washington, that is run by the Geo Group, and they have very close ties with ICE. So when I was in Seattle, I actually stood with the La Resistencia movement to campaign for abolishing some of these like unwarranted deportations of undocumented migrants, and just kind of campaign for the rights of the migrants who had been incarcerated in that center and were facing an indefinite period of time in prison. I wouldn't go too deep in that, but it brought me to a couple of art projects which kind of have the same sense, same sense of usage of these ideas of wind and the ideas around directionality. The first project is called Windward. In 2016, and windward, you would know, is kind of the direction of the wind, where is it headed. And I did a site-specific installation outside the Northwest Tacoma Detention Center, where I installed a wind vane as well as an anemometer, and I put just simple arrows around the wind vane to show where the people incarcerated inside. I had a database of the locations or home countries that the detainees were from, and so I positioned them around the wind vane, and each of these arrows would point towards that location. In the gallery as well, we had an anemometer and a wind vane setup that was getting live data from the Tacoma Detention Center, exactly where that stood outside. And every time the wind was blowing in a particular direction, the interface at the gallery itself would tell you which countries were implicated in that direction of the wind. The next project that I did around that was called Between Us a Breeze, and this was inspired by some volunteering that I did within the detention center itself. As you can imagine, a lot of these undocumented or detainees, they may be documented, just awaiting trial, but the detainees were there either without any family members, or their family members had been forcibly taken away from them and either deported or sent to another detention center in another part of the States. And so I volunteered to be a befriender, and I went in a couple of times in 2016 to talk to people in there and just to be a friend and just to spend some time with them because they had nobody else to talk to. And I realized through this experience that it was really hard to get to know somebody, across a an airtight, basically an airtight seal. And this is really not only because of the language barriers for some. It's also not also because of the cultural barriers, but it felt to me like a purely sensorial impoverishment, that I could not get to know somebody if I could not feel the wind that was moving around his body, or if I could not feel the impact that his breath had on the way that I was moving around a space. There's such a strong idea of presence when we're forming these friendships, right? And so this project was called Between Us a Breeze, and it had 2 visitation booths that were set up in the gallery, and you would speak to one another on the phone, and then it would take your voice spectrum. It'll do a very rudimentary spectral analysis of that, and then it would create these waves on the water using these fans that would just blow across the top of the reflecting pool. And it was my idea of saying, like, if you stretched out that distance between 2 people across a visitation booth, like, is there some beauty that could come out of that connection, and what is missing, when they're talking to each other? I've been thinking about a project now, with the pandemic, everybody's on Zoom across screens. I've been thinking about how this could actually function within a digital sphere. So I have some relatively juvenile experiments using OBS and some interactive software, but I wouldn't bore you with that. You feel free, please, to take that idea and to make it yours too. And the last part of that project was called Windward with an O, and I was really interested in the narrative since we started talking quite a bit to people, and I was really interested to say, like, yeah, okay, how can we take these narratives and what can we do with them? And I recorded some interview transcripts and also took some text from YouTube, and I put it in a 6-channel wind/voice installation where you would hear voices move across you in space. If you were standing in the middle of the circle, for instance, it will move across you, and at the same time you'll also hear wind move across you. You could also feel wind, move across you. So by combining these 2 things, I was really saying, what if messages could be embedded on the wind? And what if these could be directional? So like if I was standing in a particular space, could I turn in the direction of home, for instance, just like that cart was, and vocalize it and allow the wind to carry my messages back to the people that I miss or I love? So I took that idea a little bit further, and I actually conducted some interviews with undocumented migrants within Casa Latina, which is a shelter in Seattle. And using some of the text from the interviews, I couldn't use all of it, obviously. I created this installation called Aeolian Traces, which is basically the idea that when wind blows, there are traces of us that it carries with it, right? So for any given space that you're in, there's always a memory of vocal utterances in the past, or physical utterances, or physical traces of movement, and also, by extension, your biological debris that you've left in a particular space. What you breathe out, for instance, may be a trace of you in this environment. So Aeolian Traces just basically had Windward expanded. It was, instead of 6 speakers, it was now 16 speakers, and there was an array of about 24 fans. And I was doing a data visualization of UN migration data. And each of the nodes that you'll see in this demonstration were, I think, a population of about 150,000 refugees. And as they moved across a particular sphere, you can imagine I was able to trace that in a 3D sound sphere as well. So you'd actually feel the sound move across you in that ambisonic sphere. And there would be wind as well that was synced to the direction that it was moving in. So this is an example of some of the sound that was going on. I would encourage you, if you do have access to a set of headphones, this is spatialized sound, I hope. So let me make sure that I actually did turn on the test. Yeah.
มีความสามารถมีความต้องการมากมีความต้องการคือมีความ
Okay, that goes on for a fair bit. Thank you. But you get the idea. And so this piece has been done a number of times. This was the latest one, actually, at the Border Control exhibition, Penny Stamps Gallery in Michigan. And before that, it was also at Nuit Blanche in Toronto. And I used some of the skills that I have been, some of the projects that we're working on live Twitter feed to have an option for people to also post some stuff on Twitter that I could then pull into the installation as well. How am I doing for time? Still okay? Got like 10, 15 minutes more? Good? Yeah?
Perfect. Yeah.
Okay.
15, 20. Yeah.
15, 20. Perfect. Okay. Thank you. I hope I'm not boring you guys. But I hope this is resonating with you somewhat. Okay. So, at the height of the pandemic, in December, or maybe it was like June 2020, I was invited to do a residency at the windy. Sorry, I can't speak with that. The sound of the wind in the back, ironically. I was invited to do a residency in the hexagonal wind dome at Western University in London, Ontario. And so this is a picture of what it looks like inside of it, and there's the idea that it's a hexagonal dome, not a linear wind tunnel. So as well as doing these experiments on wind, just like wind going over wings and bikes and things like that, they could also simulate wind shears and actually move wind around, so they could create simulations of tornadoes. So they actually in this facility, it's just so amazing. They did these like small scale tornadoes, and they had these scaled models of houses or buildings all across wherever around the world. They would come to this place, have these small buildings, have put a lot of sensors on them, and then run the simulation of whatever class 5 hurricanes or tornadoes, and see where were the stress points. And then that could lead to architectural and engineering innovations. So while we were there, I was really interested in the idea of the tornado as a smaller scale, almost approachable entity. And we always think about tornadoes as something entirely violent and something you run away from, unless you're a storm chaser, and then that's something great for you. But in general, there's this big sense of danger and sublime around a tornado. And so I wanted to see, is it possible to imagine an improvisation or a duet with a tornado? And what would that look like? And so conceptually, I was building this from 2 points of view. One is, inspired by Tim Ingold's quote, acknowledging that the living body, as it breathes, is necessarily swept up in the currents of the medium. I suggest the wind is not so much embodied as the body end-winded. It's like setting sail, launching the body into sound like a boat in the waves, or more appropriately, like a kite in the sky. And the idea here is that the tornado would be part of you, and you would be part of that tornado. There's this kind of like mutual coexisting with that tornado. In the second one, I was interested in Darcy Thompson, one of the pioneers, I think, of bioaesthetics. Is on growth and form was really a pivotal publication back in 1917. And he says, in short, the form of an object is a diagram of forces. And basically, we can judge or deduce the forces that are acting on it or acting upon it. In the strict sense, it is a diagram. So I was interested in seeing the body as a diagram of forces, where previously we're thinking about how the wind is going inside it. Now we're wondering, how is the body actually a diagram of the forces that are acting upon it? To use the metaphor, could it be a sail or a barrier? So we this video that I just showed you, Susan Lee, who's a dance professor at York, who runs the York Dance Ensemble, she was kind enough to do these experiments with me and to devise some improvisational prompts for her students to kind of work around, or maybe she herself was going to work around it too. And then the pandemic forced us all out. So we couldn't go back in to film at all. We couldn't film this, kind of gorgeous, sublime video that we were thinking of with a dancer, dancer and a scaled tornado. And so we turned to remote ventures. And so with the York Dance Ensemble, we gave each of them a prompt that had to do with some of the things that we were saying. How can you think about the body as a sail or as a diagram of forces? And at the same time, can you transition between that and the idea that the body is also end-winded? How would you feel if there was a tornado inside your body, right? And so we took these videos that the students came up with. They were really brilliant. Really nice, and we ran it through a motion capture software online, and pardon the cheesy avatar, but this is one thing that we started off with, and using the FBX data that we got from this this input video, we created these particle system visualizations. So this was what was in the gallery space. We have a series of, I think, 15 videos that are all processed almost the same way. And it really shows this liminality between the body kind of appearing and then disappearing into a particle system of wind. And that orange glow that is going around is meant to simulate the idea of a tornado. And of course, it's right next to a dome, which was our take, or I wouldn't say it's a critical perspective, but our take on the windy dome, which was a very contained space. It was very windy, but the wind couldn't get out. Right, it doesn't actually touch the atmosphere outside of it. It's almost like this feral or this this captive energetic beast that they just kept in their pocket and they couldn't let out. So we thought of looking at the dome as a segment of Voronoi triangles that was kind of open, and that this wind would be like extruding from it. And of course, the idea of scale as well with the human is at the same scale as the tornado. Now, what is interesting about this is that we went further in the time of the pandemic to look at the communities around, and we started wondering, hey, how does the lessons that we've learned in this, or the technical chops that we got from this process, how is this going to invigorate the community? And I was running this grant called Remote Dancing and Mask Making in the Toronto Caribbean community at the time of COVID-19. Which is funded by Shirk. Thank you very much, Shirk. And it was looking at continuing these dance workshops that CCS was running for the community. That you can only imagine, it's so important in a time of physical distancing to keep these, the energy of the youth up, to keep that community going. And so we helped them with a little bit of digital literacy, but we were also very interested in ways that we could continue to do cultural, to grow their culture and to give them a continued sense of cultural identity through these technologies. So with them, we did a couple of experiments, and this is still an ongoing project around creatively putting avatars in virtual space, and also working with backdrops that were defined by the participants to create these really interesting mishmashes of virtual and analog realities. This is the St. Lucia masquerade, by the way, and that's the St. Lucia mountains at the back.
It is something that can be used to teach. It can be something that can be taught.
All right, and so there's another side also that we've been working with some dance companies to adopt some of these methodologies to create augmented dance performances. This was shown last week actually at the Citadel. So I mean there isn't that much. This was a rehearsal, but you can see at the bottom that that was what the motion capture software was rendering. This is a stock avatar, and what we ended up doing with that was to create these almost ghostly images of the dancers coming in and out. So these would be screens that were projected on around the dancers. Now, the technology was very different in this because we could go back in person to a certain extent. These were Azu Connects. We did an array of 2 of them, but ideally there would be 3. And so we would really be able to get rid of any of these distortions over here where they couldn't sense if somebody was in front of another person. But I guess something that was interesting from this process from us is the notion of data and capturing data, right? I think when we capture data from something such as this, a system such as this, motion capture, for instance, we're never really capturing all the motions, as you can imagine. Some of the movements that the dancers were making were very, very smooth and very, very swift. And so at that point in time, the computer was only able to sense one position. And then at the next slice of time, the computer would sense another position somewhere else. So then it would make this weird interpolation between those 2 points, which is totally different to how the move was actually supposed to go. So this is a process called quantization, right? And so our question really was, can you quantize culture? If we use all these tools and we're looking particularly at cultural dances, or in this case it was Caribbean cultural dance practices, are we doing them a disservice when we do motion capture and then the data actually looks like this? All these texts out here and in segmented slices that miss out all the nuances that would determine these performances. So that's kind of a question that I'm faced with now, and in terms of designing these systems that would try to understand and archive these cultural practices. The interesting thing was when I showed these to the dancers, they looked at it and they're like, "Wow, I look so cute," and we were like, "Oh, okay." It's basically like the Matrix, because you would see these just roll up across the screen as CSV in the CSV file, and those would be all the positions, XYZ positions of your joints. So I'm going to blast through my remaining slides. I have a couple more examples of projects, and I'll touch a little bit on the stuff that you guys read about as well. But we also did these projects on oral narratives where we were using digital technologies to help archiving, community archiving. I mentioned this is how we do life together. I think it's not an institutional and community divide. I think we're all in the same boat. And we need to leverage as much as we can the resources that we have at the university to support self-determination in these communities. So in this example, the Firgrove Learning and Innovation Center was this really amazing, thriving youth hub in the Jane Finch region. And we gave them 360 cameras and audio recorders, and we told them, hey, whatever you value, let's just take that. And they brought us to crazy places up on the roof, and we did these augmented reality and VR based archiving projects, where you would these are all posted online, and you would be able to and these were done by the kids as well, like all this, the dinosaur on the top of the cliff and the clouds, they're all hyperlinks to another photograph, 360 photographs with a mouse. And also they were able to put their own poetry in there, and you could access that. You could put text in there, or audio in there, and so they could also create their own music for this archiving. And it was especially poignant because that center burnt down about 6 months after the project, and so that archive became so important because it was the only living archive that they had in the last 6 months. Yeah. So a couple of other projects that I've been working on. We're also working with the Social Planning Council of York Region to do these podcast series, but very consultative, very conversational. So we invite community partners in there and have a chat. These are students who are learning how to do it, and then we will be rolling these out in the community once the restrictions are lifted. And that's Stephen Hurley, who's the director of Voice Ed Radio. You might know that. It's a very popular educational podcast series focused on town-gown relationships. And this is a project that I curated as part of Sensorium's exhibition at SLSA last year. And it's basically a virtual project called Renewal. And it has about 10 different projects, are all basically centered around different ideas of knowledge. If again, the idea of returning to the sensorium, what are the new knowledges that we can gain, and where can we get these from? So Emerging from the Water, as you're seeing over here now, is a piece by Mary Bunch and Dolene Manning, where they think about the pluriverse. They take microscopic images of flora and fauna at the waterside, and they put them in these spheres that you can visit. And some other pieces as well. I'll just maybe scroll through real quick. This one I was just mentioning before the call. This is a work by Rusilla Ho and team, where she was taking these photogrammetry models of her own room, where you basically live and work and eat and sleep in the last 2 years, and distorting that so you would fly through her subconscious pretty much. And this is a video in Nunavut. This is Grains of Universe, which is a sound piece. You can hear a bit of it, I guess. Yeah, and and this is Dan Tapper's. Oops, sorry. Dan Tapper's work's pretty amazing. This was also a photogrammetry model of a beach that Dan grew up in the UK. But he basically took the CSV file and he did some textual processing to it. So the output was really kind of unintelligible, but there were semblances of it. And that tension between real and imagined, I think, was very successfully portrayed in that piece. And this is Forest Inclusive by Jane Tingley, where she's taking live data from a tree outside her house to pipe through to this Mozilla Hubs room. Yeah, so I mean, I have a number of additional artworks that I don't think that I'll go through right now. I'm sure that they will become apparent in the Q&A. Yeah. Oh, I realized I had quite a bit here, right? Sorry, I don't mean to jump through them. But yeah, maybe a word, maybe a sentence for each of them. Okay, I don't want to take up too much of time, but I also don't want to just jump through these and let that pass away. So Terra Adventi was a project where I was looking at microbes in the atmosphere and how I could how I could work with that to embed poetry within the wind. I was looking at the DNA of microbes as a repository or an archive or maybe a book even, and using synthetic biology, I was changing some of this text and embedding some poetry in there, and then putting it within a small enclosed environment and allowing it to grow and create mist in there. I was also doing some experiments in that same project around visualization of a cloud. So this is some visualizations in Blender that I was doing around point cloud data from an icicle. And you can see the cloud just kind of gets bigger and bigger. And I was thinking like, hey, if you can customize what is actually in the microbe in the air, and if this microbe is actually contributing to the growing of clouds, right? Could you customize clouds? Could we be moving towards a state in the future where we could buy our own cloud and go like, hey, it's my girlfriend's birthday next week. I would like to get her a cloud. Something like that. And these were some of the lab-based experiments, the petri dishes that you see with monoammonium phosphate and potassium nitrate, where we could simulate these streaks and these accumulations. We didn't actually have to use like real mist. We could simulate it and you look pretty fine. Yeah, and so this project is called Proximal Spaces. Basically, it was looking at the pandemic and how everybody's really afraid of everything within the 6-foot radius. It's now this like safe zone where you sterilize anything and everything in there. And of course, the truth is bacteria don't really listen to this human-enforced 6-foot radius, right? They fly wherever they want to. And so we wanted to we wanted to visualize this in a much more aesthetically pleasing way. So you can see on the right visualization, there's these white concentric circles. And the idea is that you would be in the center, and these concentric circles would represent the distance from your body. And so we invited a group of bioartists around the world to swab their environments in concentric circles of proximity to their bodies and see what happened on the dish. And if you remember, at some point I was talking about the hospitable environment of digital technologies, and this was directly reflected in the hospitable environments of the petri dishes to be able to sustain and allow life to emerge from. And so we found this a really revelatory process, and as well as that, we had a good conversation as well with the participants about their fears about going to swab their environment during a time of COVID, swabbing the streets during the time of COVID, and thinking about like ways that we could actually live with the virus in the future. And of course, that's the rhetoric that's happening now. The Biden administration just released like the next steps, which are basically about living with the virus in the future. Last two, promise. Untitled Interspecies Invelted. I in the pandemic as well, I was just sitting down on my desk, and I started working with these motile alga called Euglena gracilis, and I was really enamored by them. I really like them very much because they respond to stimulus, and they're very fast and active, and they respond at a time frame that we can see. So I trained a computer vision algorithm on them, and I put different spots on the screen, and as they moved around them, they would trigger different segments of poetry. And so I'm doing this project again in the summer, but I'm billing it as a live-in residency where I live and I care for the Euglena gracilis, but at the same time I care for the machine algorithms that are determining the computer vision outputs as well. So in a sense, when they say, you got to train your computer to do machine learning, what does that training actually mean? And is there a form of care apart from vital maintenance that can happen that is synonymous with care for an animal, for instance? So that's the kind of investigation I'm having. I'm trying to care for myself, I'm trying to care for the Euglena, and I'm trying to care for the machine learning algorithm in that process. I don't know how it's going to end up. I know some of you mentioned this in the questions. Thank you so much for noticing it. This is one of the latest projects that I've been working on, the sound of clouds and other sonic memories. As you can see already that I'm very invested in data, but I also am very invested in multimodal sensory data. Especially when you think about something like climate change or these big hyper objects, end of the world, what are we going to do? Data is just one part of the puzzle, and data conventionally known and represented through infographics is just one piece of the puzzle. What if we could find a way to establish a repository of information that is multisensory, that's not visual, that is maybe sonic, that relies on participatory networks? So Sound of Cloud is generally a conversational interview series where I interview somebody about their earliest sonic memories, and in particular their sonic memories about their environments. And I start to ask them, what do you value in your memories? And as they go through a process of identifying and expressing where the values are, it becomes very natural to go, well, okay, how can we conserve these memories? So, for instance, people have been talking about, the sound of crickets in the park on their first date, for instance, and you go like, how can you value this memory and keep it as an archive, but use that as a catalyst to say, well, how can we conserve that environment around which the crickets are existing? Right. So I have some validation for it, but I wouldn't bore you with that right now. If you want to learn more, I can talk a little bit more about that, sure. But I will conclude with this statement. Okay, why do I think all this is important? Why? In fall last year, we had a talk as part of Regeneration's All Our Relations series, where we invited Lakota artist Suzanne Kite and Devin Rothenberg. And one thing she said resonated with me very powerfully, which was that the Lakota decision-making process embeds its ethics 7 generations ahead. So to build something ethically in Lakota decision-making processes is to imagine its life cycle and its death cycle simultaneously. And the ways that a relationship with the land is built on this idea of reciprocity and renewal, not on extraction and intervention for the immediate, current future. So when we think about climate mitigation as well, like, can we actually think about this 7 generations ahead? And will that change our desire and our speed towards, fast carbon extraction, climate geoengineering, and these really interventionist tactics? So our children and their children will inherit all these different systems that we have designed, and it's for them that a lot of my work is for. These are my kids playing around in my house. And so as an artist working at the intersection of art, design, and technology, I really am very passionate about the ways that we can design these systems in the future. So thank you so much for your time and your energy in sitting through this. I'm happy to field any questions you may have. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Joel. That was amazing. And thank you for also ending with that question about why we make work and the long tail, right, in the tech term, right, of the notion of thinking about the implications of work and its impact, right? Yep. Especially for someone who works with such an ephemeral, right, material, right, as sound and wind, and it's great to hear you talk about that. So I want to open it up. If there are questions from students or other folks who have a question for Joel about his practice, about the Petri dish as a canvas, any number of questions that folks might be interested to raise, just feel free to unmute yourself and ask. One question that I had was just to talk a little bit about the status of the community engaged works. That seems to be, that's something that came up is that sort of new in the work? Or, I mean, there's something how you think about that kind of participation and mapping it previously, and now there's a different emphasis on it maybe, and how that came about in your work.
Yeah, I think it really so this kind of goes back a long way. I actually do feel like it does go back a long way, where um, you know, as an undergraduate student, I was an ecologist, I loved going out in the field. We would do these field experiments, observations, you take measurements of the environment, and at some point, when I was in my later undergraduate years, everything became biostatistics. And it was, you know, at that time, right? I mean, computers were becoming. I mean, I think when I was in school, like having a laptop was actually a real luxury. You know, I don't know if you guys remember those days, but anyway, and so like we turned to biostatistics, and I remember spending an entire semester out of the field, like inside the laboratory, the so-called quote unquote in silico research, and it really killed me. And so when I wasn't in grad school and I was working with data, to a certain extent, it was very exciting because I started coding fairly late, and so it became like a tool that you were using. You know, it's like a guitar effects pedal board. You know, you'd be like, wow, you know, can I change the gain on this? Can I change the filter on this? And you would do all of that with data as well and see how that turned out aesthetically. But then I realized. Like if you're talking about data around certain things, you know, it wasn't neutral. You know, you can't just be taking data about certain things and then saying we're doing this, and not really do anything about the situation that the data is trying to portray. I mean, data visualization has a form and a function, right? And information design as well. It's meant to spur you on towards some kind of innovation. And you know, there are people who talk about the intrinsic value of just aesthetifying data and making it pleasant. And I totally believe in that as well. In fact, I teach a class called Creative Data Visualization, where it's a lot about just like where are the aesthetic end goals in this data set, in this particular data set. With the wind, obviously, you know, you have a lot of that. But I also believe that it is a continuum. That a lot of our social agency is a continuum between physical and digital spaces. And so when I was starting to work with data, I started thinking about the UN census as a kind of critical collection. You know, are they collecting the right kinds of data, and are they erasing populations that may not fit within that kind of demographics? And there are, you know, some interesting case studies in there as well. But I thought that one way that I would bridge that would be to first and foremost use multimodal, not just visual, but multimodal sensory data forms. So then there was there was the wind, and there was the sound, and then from there, you know, I started going like, okay, so sound. Who can I get the sound from, and how can I be accountable to this? And then that conversational practices started coming out from there. And so, you know, that's just been a process that's just been so rewarding. I'll say one last thing, which is, you know, the idea of conversational practices is you know, it's a very well-worn adage today that we don't talk enough to each other, right? And in particular, I think we don't talk enough to our parents and our grandparents. And I'll give you an example. When I started asking my students to write positionality statements, such as the one that I gave earlier on, you know, some of them had never thought to ask their grandparents about where they came from and what kinds of situations did they face, circumstances did they face that had led them to this position. And because of that, you know, they never recognize actually the resilience that has come through their grandparents' situation down to their generation, which is like seriously amazing. You know, and some of these examples are so so edifying and so energizing. So I would say, you know, if you have any opportunity to do it, you know, just take it. Just ask your grandparents about like what their lived experience was when they were growing up and how they came to where they settled in eventually. I hope that answers the question.
It does. It definitely does. Great. Yeah. Anyone want to raise their hand and ask? Oh,
There was a question in the chat.
Ian, are you here? Do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question?
Or I can ask it to.
Ian, are you still here, Ian?
I think in the past their mic was busted.
Okay.
I guess I'll ask it. When reading, oh, that's a German word. Umwelt Microbiota. It was interesting to see microbes framed as whether. Sorry, I might move the question. It's interesting to see microbes framed as weather travels with their own unique memories and stories to tell. By sharing empathy and respect for the microbial world, you wish the public take up ecological and moral responsibilities. This leads me to my question: do you think forming that empathy and respect for microbes can help us be more empathetic and respectful towards immigrants or refugees? After all, they are also weather travelers with their own unique memories and stories to tell.
That is fantastic. That's a fantastic question, Ian. And I will say that coming to that question is really understanding the power of storytelling across the arts and the sciences. And when we started that project, Microbial Umwelt, it was about trying to put yourselves in the microbe's position. And to a certain extent, anthropomorphizing it, but so as to allow ourselves, in our limited capacities, to understand how a microbe might live out its days. And so we had this process of looking for microbes in the most extreme environments, just to find out how resilient microbes are, to get that, get that sense of, you really are weathered and you really have been traveling a lot, but you're also very adapted to living in these very difficult situations, right? So we went to the edge of the Niagara Falls, but it was actually on the Buffalo side, right, where they have these rapids just before it hits the falls, right? And so we were reaching out over an ice shelf looking for microbes in the water. And then as Stephanie mentioned, at Coalesce, we also send kites up in the middle of what would be a gale force wind. It's not the best idea, I tell you that. But we sent the weather balloon up with a payload trying to look for microbes that would exist in such tumultuous environments. And it may really just be that the reason why we're doing that is to be able to find metaphors for the resilience in the communities that have weathered these extreme environments in the human condition, in the human worlds, and to see how the microbes or how this passage of microbial resilience can be adapted to stories of humanity. So I mean, it's a very astute observation, and we started looking at the microbes as this venerable sage that we would ask advice about, like, how do we actually do climate mitigation, really, I mean, you guys have been here like for billions of years, right? How would we do that? So you're spot on. Thanks for that question, Ian.
Fantastic. Did anyone else have a question in mind? If not, I do have a few that I was going to post in chat, but I wanted to give people a chance. Ian says thank you. All right.
Questions, you can just unmute yourself. You don't need to raise your hand if there are folks with questions. But yeah, sure, go ahead, Famous. Joe put his hand up.
Yep.
You wanna unmute yourself?
Hi, sorry, I know you just said we didn't have to raise our hand, but I was in the middle of doing it, and so I did anyways. Hi, my question is, I was thinking about when you were talking about the wind and how you had an idea where it could it could send a message, basically send a message via the wind. It sounded something like out of like World War I, like when they absolutely needed to send a message just any possible way. And it sounded like a really cool idea and concept. And then the tornado dance scene, it really started making me think like this stuff could really be great for film, like all the animations and stuff. And I was wondering, have you ever thought of doing like a documentary of all the work that you've done?
No, I haven't, to be very honest with you. If the opportunity arises, I would be interested in doing that. Yeah, I mean, I think, I think it's the works are interesting in themselves, and they may make for a, I mean, if you find it interesting, thank you, that's great. And I also think that it's important to value the connections that went into each of these pieces as well. So there's a somewhat painful memory in the wind pieces. The Sisyphean tragedy of not being able to go home, and then this lingering thread of going through the detention center and realizing that people are really living this stuff, not able to move. That I think would be a very important thing to focus on, as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I did like it. There's just so much story, and it's the stories of just thousands of people, and I think it would be very interesting to see, and as well as the visual element. I really liked the maps that showed all the different. I'm losing my words, like all the different how often people wanted to go to a specific location and how close everyone was to each other.
Yeah.
And yeah, I just think it would be a great film, and it would be awesome to get this a lot more attention. I didn't quite understand what exactly you did before coming into this. Like I had read the articles, and I was honestly just very confused. But yeah, but this
hopefully it was a little bit. Yeah, hopefully this talk cleared up a little bit of that. And if you're still confused, they're very simple projects, so I could explain it to you really really quick.
I got most. I mean, they're all very interesting. I really like the wind one. But yeah, that was mainly my question. Just have you ever thought of documenting and sharing it on a broader scale? Because I think it would do really well.
Yeah, thank you. It's interesting. Yeah,
fantastic. Awesome. We have a question in chat from Nicole. Nicole, do you want to unmute yourself? Or I can read it. That works too. Okay. Yep. Okay, cool. Okay. So from Nicole, was there any other physical feature that you felt was missing besides the feeling of breeze for your inspiration between us and breeze?
That's a good question. I think an important consideration was the size of the pool, because as at different proximities to yourself, you actually have different sensations of the intent of the person that's entering that space. Right, so it was important for me to stretch this out so that it didn't become almost like a tension that they say, like, if you walk within 1.5 feet of somebody, then it triggers their fight or flight response innately. So there's that tension there, right? And then if it's 3 feet, there's a kind of social distance, but then it engenders certain kinds of communication. And for people to come in and actually be open to share and start to talk to somebody across the other side, it has to be more than 11 feet. And this is all documented actually since the 50s by a researcher called Edward Hall, an anthropologist who wrote this book called Proxemics, the hidden dimension of man. So he did these diagrams around what these concentric circles would have. I can post that later in the chat. But so the idea is that in addition to just thinking about the breeze, there was also the relationship of space and the relationship of people to each other that was very consciously choreographed in that piece.
Fantastic. Yeah, really cool. And I guess just a follow-up question to add on to that. It seems that your projects were focusing on like the major human senses, the five ones that we are aware of. Have you ever considered like expanding it to like the other? It's weird to call them like less known, but there's like theories of the extension of senses that go beyond the standard five, and working in that kind of frame.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I've thought about that a little bit, and I think these are coming up even more when at Sensorium we think about, what does a return to the sensorium mean, and how can these senses be critically reevaluated in a time of I guess clairaudience or clairvoyance, and all these somatosensory extensions. Incidentally, which is an interesting thought, I think. I was reading recently about how AI is defining what the seat of intelligence is. Sensorium thinks about the seat of perception, and AI is kind of thinking about where the seat of intelligence is, and it's rooted in the brain, right? So Western science or Western medicine kind of goes like, okay, the brain's the whole order, the system, and everything's trickling down, and therefore that's how artificial intelligence machine learning is made, as according to those Dartmouth professors in the 50s, who has all their biases in it and whatnot. But I was reading about Chinese medicine, that where the flow of a body is governed not by a central entity, but by 11 different organs. That are all very, very important for vital maintenance of the body, and none of them include the brain. So, it's interesting. There's this decentralized intelligence into the limbs, but not only like the five senses that we kind of associate with our sensory expanse, but like these ideas of circulation, flow, the blood, that create this overall chi, that sustains the body. And I started wondering, like, how would this be a recipe for creating a new version of artificial intelligence? Like, what would that actually look like?
Really, that is a graduate thesis project if I've ever heard of one.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So, if any of you want to work with me, please work with me on this project. God knows I need help.
Paige, how are we doing on time? Can we ask more questions or?
Do one more question, if that works. Yeah.
Is there anyone that wants to ask a burning one? I have a good one lined up. If not, alrighty, then I will paste the one I had in chat. This one is from Kelsey Conlon. Sorry if I butchered that last name. But after reading the, God, I'm not pronouncing it again, as well as your website, there seemed to be a common theme of replicating specific relationships between humans as well as the world. Do you think that these art pieces provide explanations on the relationship between humans and nature, or are they more so to provide evidence that we exist as one idea / being?
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely many metaphors that we were considering when we were working on these projects. Gaia, of course, the Gaia hypothesis is one big one. And body with many parts, many organs, and spaceship Earth as well. But I think the issue with thinking of something as one idea or one body is really that we start to assume that there's a operations manual for that one body. And of course, we realize now that there are so many diverse communities that there never is a one-size-fits-all perspective to existence. And so much as I appreciate the prior thinkings in the Gaia hypothesis, in the ideas of the Earth as a superorganism. I also am really enamored by the ideas of communities as these distributed nodes that together contribute to an emergence of life in general. Sorry, my son just came to say hi.
Fantastic. No, that.
Yeah, I think that maybe he came to say hi, and also Joel, Dad, come eat dinner. So that was great. Yeah, wonderful. I think so much inspiring stuff, and definitely want to encourage also the idea that people want to work on the recentering different questions of intelligence outside the brain. Sounds like an amazing project. So yeah, thank you so much. And for those of you who are on the call next week we have a break, but then in 2 weeks it's Crystal Campbell who will be giving a screening presentation Q&A. So thank you, Joel. That was wonderful. And you'll be hearing from us soon with more feedback and responses from the students.
That's great. Thank you so much, Paige, famous Stephanie, who's not around anymore, but thanks so much everyone for being here and sitting through this. Email me anytime if you want to find out more, if you want to stay in touch, that's totally fine. Thanks again.
Thank you. Okay, good night. Have a good dinner.
Okay. See you guys later.